continuing with the Practicing the Way series. We've explored Sabbath and prayer and fasting, and now we're having a look at the practice of solitude. We're implementing these practices, the kind of life that Jesus modelled for us here on earth, learning from him how to live our whole lives, becoming his apprentices. These blocks are focusing on the spiritual disciplines, the practices and rhythms that Jesus and his followers build their lives upon. We're not trying to squeeze more into our busy lives. This isn't the spiritual tick list of merit. Practicing these does not make us more spiritual. They don't make God love us more. Rather, they position us for encounter, for transformation. We're shining a light on our lives and posing the question, is my lifestyle conducive to following the way of Jesus? John Ortberg says this: God is not interested in something called your spiritual life. He's just interested in your life, and particularly love. Your love for God and for others. You can't gauge your life by devotional practices, or else in Jesus' day the Pharisees would be the ones who were always doing great. It's about my capacity to be able to experience love, joy, and peace through the Spirit. And then the practices are a means toward an end in growing in that. Making space to God, making space for God, disrupting the automatic flow that usually disrupts my life. What if the greatest threat to Christian faith today isn't secularism, but distraction? We live in an era where it's possible to go through your entire life and never really be alone. Even when we're alone, we're on our phone or the internet or in our entertainment of choice. Cal Newport, the author of Digital Minimalism, writes, "It is now possible to completely banish solitude from your life. The moment most of us are ever alone in a room or even in our car, we reach for the appendage of our device, we check our texts, we open social media, we'll read the news, play music, or put on a podcast. Our devices keep us tethered to the world of noise. And the threat of all this noise isn't just to our minds or even to our bodies, it's to our souls. How many moments have I missed where God wanted to speak to me or shape me or just share a moment together, but I was distracted by my device?" Luke 5 says this: "The news about Jesus spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to the lonely places and prayed." Now, those of us who were around a number of years ago, probably about 6 years ago now, will be familiar with the translation of lonely places, as it is the Greek word eremos. So eremos can be translated as the desert, the deserted place, the desolate place, the solitary place, or the quiet place. Jesus' world was very different from most of ours, where there are people as far as the eye can see. Most people in his day lived in small, rural villages. Most were farmers on small plots of land. All lived within walking distance of the synagogue. And outside those populated areas, there were vast tracts of empty, uninhabited land called the eremos. Jesus would regularly disappear into that wide open space, all by himself, to pray. Luke tells us he often withdrew to the eremos. And here are a few translations that are from different versions. He frequently withdrew to the wilderness and prayed. He often slipped away to be alone so he could pray. As often as possible, Jesus withdrew to the out-of-the-way places for prayer. When we read the Gospels, we find story after story of Jesus, all alone, out in nature, just him and God. In fact, when you read the Gospels, you notice in Jesus' life a rhythm of retreat and return. Jesus would retreat into solitude. He would get away from people, from noise, from stimulation, to pray and rest and listen for his Father's voice. But he wasn't a hermit. He would then return to be with people in community and to love and serve. We see Jesus toggle back and forth between solitude and community. There are all sorts of ways to group these practices of Jesus that we've been following, but arguably solitude and community are the two basic containers for all the practices. They are the twin pillars of the spiritual life, the two legs by which we travel the way of Jesus. The problem is, many of us in the digital age never really go all the way into solitude or all the way into community. Instead, in the words of Sherry Turkle, we're often alone together. We can be with people, but not actually in community, where relationships never go beneath the surface to where you are known and you know people. And we can be in a room alone by ourselves, but on our devices. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote these words: "Let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound perils and pitfalls. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings, and the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair." We're drawn to solitude like we're drawn to community, but we're also scared of it. Which is why our minds are likely to raise objections like, yeah, but I'm an extrovert, or I'm a young parent, or I live a busy life, or what about social justice and mission? But again, Jesus often withdrew into the eremos. And he was Jesus. You think you're busy? People were literally clinging to him, or digging through ceilings, or begging from the roadside for his touch. And yet, in spite of the demand, he would regularly slip away. In fact, you could chart Jesus' life on an axis of demand and withdrawal. It seems that the more in demand Jesus became, the more he would disappear into the quiet. We read stories of people literally going out searching for him, into the eremos, and in doing so, he laid down for all his apprentices a pattern to follow. And this pattern has come to be called the practice of solitude. So firstly, we're going to clarify what solitude is not. First, it's not loneliness. Richard Foster in Celebration of Discipline writes, "Loneliness is inner emptiness, but solitude is inner fulfillment." Loneliness is a felt absence, but solitude is a felt presence. Loneliness is a gnawing ache in the human heart for love, the gaping wound of the modern soul. Sociologists tell us Gen Z is the loneliest generation of all time. But solitude is not loneliness. Secondly, it's not isolation from God. Isolation is a movement away from relationship, but solitude is a movement toward relationship. And finally, it's not aloneness. When social scientists study the effect of solitude on the human person, they distinguish between solitude and aloneness. Aloneness is what we introverts love. It's when we're not with other people, but we might be texting people or watching TV or reading a book. We're alone, but not in solitude. And this is a crucial distinction to make, because many people mistakenly assume that solitude is a preference-based spiritual discipline for introverts. Now, this is a tragedy for extroverts because they never experience the depth of intimacy with God that is only possible in the quiet place. And it's a tragedy for us introverts too, because solitude is warped into a spiritualized version of a little me time. In reality, studies show that once you distinguish between solitude and aloneness, introverts have no higher desire for or enjoyment of solitude than extroverts. So, what is it? Very simply, The practice of solitude is intentional time in the quiet with ourselves and God. Ruth Haley Barton put it another way. Solitude, at its most basic and profound level, is simply an opportunity to be ourselves with God. This is why it's not the same thing as aloneness. We're not alone, we're with God. In solitude, we get rid of our scaffolding, our crutches, no friends to talk to or to message, no emails, no music, no entertainment. It's a place free of distraction. The only inputs are God and our own heart laid open before God, our nakedness, our weakness, our sin, our vulnerabilities. And this is why solitude has two companions, silence and stillness. Silence is pretty self-explanatory, but think about two dimensions to silence. Exterior silence, where we silence the noise outside of us. No people in a crowded coffee shop, no TV in the background, no music, no dings and pings from your phone, just quiet. But the second dimension is interior silence, where we attempt, and this is much easier said than done, to quiet all the thoughts and worries and emotions and rumblings of the heart inside us. And this, in turn, is designed to lead to stillness. The Eastern Orthodox Bishop Callistus Ware defines stillness this way. Stillness is a state of inner tranquility or mental quietude and concentration. Not simply silence, but an attitude of listening to God and of an openness to God. It's coming to a place where the troubled waters of our hearts settle down like a glassy lake in the early morning, and we're just there waiting. And most of the great ones of the way of Jesus down through history would all say that solitude is one of the most important of all the practices of Jesus. Henry Nouwen said that without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to Him. The more intimate a relationship, the more it requires time together. If I was never alone with Kath, if we were always with other people, always on the go, always in a loud, noisy environment, we would never be intimate. But the Eremos isn't just a place, it's a practice. We don't have to go out into the Judean desert or the wilderness of the Lake District, but we can practice this in our daily life, walking to a park, down the street, or sitting in our favourite chair at home, or getting up early before the family are awake. We must learn to find the Eremos. One early Christian father gave this advice. Find in the busy city the desert of the monks, meaning find solitude, silence, and stillness right in the middle of our ordinary life. So how do we make space for God? The same way as Jesus. We retreat, we slip away, we find a quiet place, and there we just be with our Father. We need this practice now more than ever. We need what Cardinal Robert Serra of Guinea called the power of silence. But honestly, so many of us avoid it at all costs. Dallas Willard said this: solitude and silence are the most radical of all the disciplines for the spiritual life because they most directly attack the sources of human misery and wrongdoing. Silence is required to complete solitude, for until we enter quietness, the world still lays hold of us. If you think about the gravity of his claim that solitude is the most radical of all the spiritual disciplines, all the practices of Jesus are radical in our day and age, like Sabbath and community and generosity. But could it be that solitude is the most radical and as a result, the most neglected. But Jesus went into solitude all the time. Do we really think we can live without what Jesus considered essential? And Jesus' invitation was, come and follow me. Another way to translate it is, come and follow my way of life. So if you're thinking, is solitude for me? Yes, it is. It's for all people, for all place, for all time. Now, how you practice that has to be customized for your personality and stage of life and living situation. But if Jesus needed this core discipline, how much more so do we? But that being said, Jesus doesn't command us to go. In fact, very few of the spiritual disciplines are ever commanded. Jesus doesn't command us to read scripture or live in community or even go to church. He just does all these things and says, follow me. We're not commanded, we're invited. Ruth Haley Barton again, she writes this: the invitation to solitude and silence is just that. It's an invitation to enter more deeply into the intimacy of relationship with the one who waits just outside the noise and the busyness of our lives. It is an invitation to communication and communion with the one who is always present, even when our awareness has been dulled by distraction. It's an invitation to the adventure of spiritual transformation in the deepest places of our being, an adventure that will result in greater freedom and authenticity and surrender to God than we have yet experienced. Like I said before, this isn't a shut out the world for a bit of me time, as much as some of us might want that. But Henry Nouwen, he called it the furnace of transformation. Without it, we remain victims of our society and continue to be entangled in the illusions of the false self. We come to a place of surrender and we let go of our self-absorption. We still ourselves enough to see with the revelation of the Spirit what is really going on in here. And in the quiet, in our weakness, not offering anything, not doing anything, but just being, we realize that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And our Creator, He knows us, He loves us, He delights in us. And those who have made this practice of Jesus an integral part of their lives all attest to a major fruit of solitude, which is compassion. Couldn't our world do with some compassion right now? In our modern world of ever-increasing pace and quick fixes and life hacks and instant messaging and emojis, of polarized politics, cancel culture, unrest and war, have we lost our compassion? But Thomas Merton, he said this: it is in deep solitude that I find the gentleness with which I can truly love my brothers. The more solitary I am, the more affection I have for them. It is pure affection and filled with reverence for the solitude of others. Solitude and silence teach me to love my brothers for what they are, not for what they say. Our metric, Jesus' metric, for a maturing life is love. The inseparable love of God and love of others. Ultimately, the invitation to solitude is an invitation to intimacy with God. As St. John of the Ladder of the 6th century, he said, the friend of silence comes close to God. We let go of our childish demand to consume, to have an experience. In humility, we remember that our God is not a narcotic that we top up on. Rather, He is life, the definitive I am, and how immense His grace is that Jesus made a way for us to dwell with Him. So do you want to come close to God? Then let us follow Jesus into the quiet place.